So this is going to have a different feel to it this morning because in the past times that we've done this, I've been able to have the kids upstairs. Now you can sit over here. That way you can see the screen as we go. You can cross in front of the screen. That's okay. They can't see your haircut if you walk out tall. Hey, Josh, just so you know, I had no idea how much of a fan of you that Nye was until about 3 days ago when he decided he didn't like the haircut that he got and he gave himself a much more intense haircut. So
I think we should see it.
Nah, just come sit by me for just a second. Even Grandma's saying it's cool. Hey, look, this isn't part of the recorded part of our Sunday school class. You don't have to worry about anybody seeing it. No, I don't include this. I promise.
Maybe they can see it later.
Okay, if you sit there, you have to be quiet. All right. Well, I'm not going to try and talk you into it any more than that. Sorry, Josh and William. You guys apparently don't have enough influence over Nye, or he doesn't love you enough to care. So I think that when you see him after social distancing, you should give him some good reason to love you more. All right, everybody that wants to, that's got them here, Mom, since you're here, and here, Nye. I did print out copies of these. Just sit here beside me. That way you can see the screen. You can't even see the screen from where you are. I tried.
For a minute.
Just for a minute. All right, just catching us up. Last week, we were on encourage as one of the words or focus points for our Dealing with Messy Relationship series. The week before that was love. So we've been in the book of John, we've been in the book of Acts, and we're moving into the book of Matthew now for this series, where we are this morning. Just to kind of set context, the point of our lesson this morning is forgiveness restores and strengthens relationships. Outside of the notes that are prepared for the lesson, there may be different places along the way that you guys will be willing to jump in and share some thoughts about just how forgiveness has played a significant role in healing for relationships that you're familiar with. But I have some thoughts myself on that. But let me ask a question just for us to kind of get our brain juices flowing this morning. When's the last time it cost you a lot to fix something? Anybody? I gave please. Last time it cost you a lot to fix something. I'll throw this out there. We had our air conditioning unit do something where it just was clicking on and off, and we ended up paying somebody to fix it. And then when they came out and they did what we told them to fix, they said, hey, we can do this other thing too if you want us to do it. And then when they did that, they ended up breaking the whole thing. They broke a line and all the Freon pumped out, and to get it replaced, you're going to have to use the Freon that's no longer good anymore. And that was going to cost a lot. So long story short, it cost us $6,500 to fix the mistake that the repairman came out and made. So that's the last time that comes to mind. The reason I remember $6,500 is because I just turned in my tax receipts. So I just that painful reminder of last summer. Anybody else? Anything they can recall last time it cost you a lot to fix something?
Does my dog count?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a something, I think.
Yeah, that's about it. Right before Thanksgiving.
That wasn't a small expense.
What was that?
That wasn't a small expense. Speaking of getting something fixed, in the context of getting something, I guess you guys had an expense expanding your family that was getting something fixed not that long ago that was very beneficial for the effort. We got Haven for all of those troubles.
Yep, that too.
That wasn't the first thing that came to mind, but the semantics of it brought that to mind.
Well, I was thinking about it. I just didn't want to use that as a
I mean, it's Mother's Day. I feel like you're going to have a hard time getting a better example. So, I mean, here's part of the lesson, though. That I'll read this part of the examples for you. All right, Gabriel, I want you to go set that down now. Gabriel's very determined to get involved in our Sunday school lesson from a distraction perspective. A mulligan is a gimme in golf. If a player makes a bad shot, mulligan is the chance to redo that one shot. It's a little perk that's great for social golfers, and it's funny. It's almost like these are my words. And really bad golfers like me, even though they're usually limited to one mulligan per game, even though Tiger Woods occasionally could use a mulligan, mulligans are not allowed in professional golf. Wouldn't it be nice to occasionally be given a mulligan, a redo in a relationship? So we're talking about forgiveness. Getting a redo in a relationship is kind of the direction we're going with the idea of forgiveness. Ever said something that you regretted, ever done something or forgotten to do something that you wish could be corrected? Life is not a game, but it would be nice to avoid the penalty and consequences of a mistake and simply move forward. So we're talking about forgive. See if this changes here. Slide did change on your screens, right? Technical here, so I'm looking for some north-south feedback. Yes, this worked. All right, thanks, Josh. So what comes to mind when you think of the word forgiveness? Anyone?
Hurt?
Being able to move forward peacefully.
Okay, that's a very forward-looking idea of forgiveness. More than I mean, those are the impacts that we really look forward to. That's probably where our lesson's going to end up going with that. Thank you for that, Neil. Anybody else? What comes to mind when you think of the word forgiveness? So nice. Forgetting the mistake that someone did is his concept of forgiveness. I think that we've had a conversation about that at the house. I don't want to specifically disagree with the idea of forgetting, because forgiveness, if you want to say that God forgets something in the idea of forgiveness, that would imply that God's not perfect and there's something that he wouldn't be able to recall. But I think the choice of not remembering might be a more apt description for forgiveness, making it as if something didn't happen. Anyone else? Well, we're going to move into the study part where we're going to be in Matthew chapter 18. But as we go into the study, we want to make sure that our thought process is focused on asking God to help us identify people that we need to forgive, or maybe people that we would need to seek forgiveness from, and then thank him for the forgiveness that he's given us. Hey, I warned you guys ahead of time. Battery. Okay, guys, we have at least 8 minutes to finish up this lesson. If we don't get to finish it, we have to restart on the phone. We won't get the slides, but I'll try and go at an 8-minute pace. Not really. We're going to finish the last of this on the phone. Let me read to you guys the setting real quick. Jesus had just given instructions as to how to deal with believers who sin against other believers. That was in the beginning of Matthew chapter 18, actually right up before these verses. And while reconciliation was the goal of Jesus' instructions, anticipated that there would be times when the sinner might not be willing to be reconciled, and the church would need to discipline that person. Considering Jesus' instructions, the disciple Peter had a question concerning exactly how many times he was required to forgive a fellow believer who sinned against him. Hence the slide there with all of those tick marks. If somebody is, that's where we're going to be, if you can visualize this medieval depiction of what occurred. Somebody could read the conversation that started with Peter then from Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 and 22.
Then Peter approached him and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? As many as 7 times? I tell you, not as many as 7, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7.
So we're looking at and that's where technical difficulties kicked us off of recording our live Zoom session. So we're going to resume this, but without the rest of the class here. The rest of the class did finish the session. But for those of you that are viewing this right now, you get to have the benefit of the completed lesson, but you'll have the opportunity to also answer the questions on your own without the group discussion. So with that, let me open up and begin a screen share for our slides, and we will pick back up. Okay. So as you just heard, Neil read Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 22. What this passage here introduces is something we're about to look at. You see where Christ is responding to Peter's presumptive answer of something that sounds really good. Hey, shall I forgive somebody 7 times? And Christ's response to him is one that appears to almost make a mockery of the 7 by, doing the math on there, saying 490 times, which is not really what Christ is pointing out, that 490 times is the number, but that there isn't a limit to the number of times that forgiveness should be rendered. So as we look into the parable where Jesus spoke about forgiveness, he told the parable in response to Peter's question, but since Peter was a leader among the disciples, he spoke for the group. So all the disciples may have been wondering the same question, just like maybe we're ourselves asking a question about how many times do I need to demonstrate or show forgiveness to others. So it's not a question that we can really blame Peter for asking, even though we already know what Christ's response was. But we know that Peter was the one who asked it, and what he was effectively asking, is there a limit to the amount of grace I need to be extending? Christ's response is one that exemplifies his nature with regard to grace and mercy. How many times are we called to let the same person slide off the hook? Well, it's a legitimate question. Peter, he speculated. He said 7. So that was the number of completeness. So maybe he thought that was the right answer. The rabbis of that day challenged people to overlook an offense up to 3 times. So Peter was going above and beyond. They had the whole concept of 3 strikes and you're out. But Peter being generous wasn't the answer nonetheless. Forgiving someone 7 times more than doubled what culturally was expected by way of what the Pharisees were promoting. But he upped the ante, doubling the grace of the religious leaders and even raising the bar an extra notch. So we'll consider this. Why do we have such a difficult time forgiving others? We discussed this as a class, looking at our human nature, looking at resentment, ourselves getting in the way. I'll pause for just a second and allow you to ponder that as you think, why do you personally sometimes find it difficult to forgive other people? Peter was probably feeling pretty good about himself. And maybe we feel good about ourselves maybe when we put a large tip on a dinner, when we go out to a restaurant. Not lately, hopefully, since we're all isolated in our homes. But in these moments where we feel really big-hearted, we want to pat ourselves on the back and say, all right, I feel like I've done the right thing. But Jesus surely stunned Peter with his response. I'm going to take your 7. I'm going to raise it 70-fold. And Jesus is saying that grace should offer to others, the way that we extend grace to others shouldn't have any limits whatsoever. So even though we don't expect somebody to be offending us 490 times or 50 or 60 or 70 times by the same person, so that we'd say, okay, here's the limit. The idea is that Christ specifically is exaggerating here for effect. He's creating a ridiculous scenario to capture the attention of the disciples. And he's setting us up now with that eye-opening answer, this supposedly ridiculous answer, where he's saying, just keep forgiving. So in the next verses, we're going to see that we should also remember specifically that God forgave us, which is the counter to the answer of when do you find it difficult to forgive. Hopefully, as we're looking into this, we're going to see that part of our obligation and opportunity to forgive is spawned of the realization that God forgave us. So now we're looking at Matthew chapter 18, 23 through 27. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle accounts, one who owed 10,000 talents was brought before him. Since he didn't have the money to pay it back, his master commanded that he, his wife, his children, and everything he had be sold to pay the debt. At this, the servant fell face down before him and said, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you everything." Then the master of that servant had compassion, released him, and forgave him the loan. A good story is oftentimes the way that preachers today will capture somebody's attention. Christ was a master of parable, and in this story that he's telling, he's demonstrating through the example of this king a great debt forgiven. 10,000 talents was more than this man would likely have the ability to earn and repay in his lifetime. You see the equivalent value that the master commanded for repayment was that he, his wife, his children, everything he had to be sold. So effectively, his whole family becoming slaves and every asset that he had being sold to repay these 10,000 talents. But at the servant's request, as he humbly fell before his master and requested what amounted to mercy, his master extended that mercy and didn't just give him what he asked for. The servant said, "Be patient with me and I'll pay you everything." He was asking for more time. But the master didn't give him more time. He released him and he forgave him his entire debt. People lean in and listen to stories like this, something that's well told. Jesus was a master of that. He was driving home the point now of the 70 times 7. It was not only an actual story, but an illustration of the truth Jesus wanted to teach. When we look at his debt crisis, it's easy to compare our own debts. I don't think that we're likely going to experience the same mercy and grace if we go to our debtors in the form of credit card debtors or mortgage and different things that we owe today. But the idea is that as in this interpersonal relationship, there was the petition for forgiveness. There was a relationship there that had the opportunity to become one where one man's entire livelihood, his family, all his goods were sold. He owed a crazy amount of money, and he didn't really have any way of paying it back. So when the king called in his note, the king was petitioned to give him extra time, and he didn't. He forgave the entire debt. So in his astonishing act of grace and mercy, the king relieved the man of his responsibility, pardoned the debt, all of it. And just like us, we have a debt that's, we were just looking or just considering maybe a financial debt, but we have a debt that's one that we owe to Christ. Our rebellion, our offense against God is a debt that's so huge. You can balance the books however you want, but there's no way for us to pay off that debt. And we could ask God, just give me enough time in my life. Just give me the opportunity with the things that I know I'll do good for the rest of my life. Just let me work through this. Let me pay off this debt. And even so, Christ knows that there is no way for us to pay off this debt. And so his only response to us out of his grace and mercy is to pay the debt in full for us. And that's what his actions were on the cross. God's forgiven us the debt. We don't deserve the forgiveness, but God in his grace and mercy extends forgiveness to us through Jesus Christ, and that's why we're free. So as we look into the next verses, let's see that we need to forgive because God forgave us. Matthew 18, verse 28, and then ahead to 32 and 33. That servant, remember, this is the one that had just been forgiven a 10,000 talent debt. That servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, a minuscule amount compared to the 10,000 talents. He grabbed him, started choking him, and said, "Pay what you owe." Then, after he had summoned him, his master said to him, so we fast forward, we skipped over to what happened when the person who had just been forgiven is seeking repayment of his own debt. The king hears about this. Verse 32, then after he had summoned him, his master said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you also have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" The king had set the man free from his huge debt. He was allowed to go free, but instead of running in a direction that followed the example that the king set for him, he ran in the wrong direction. He ran after somebody who owed him money. And the second man's debt, it wasn't just small, it really was insignificant compared to the debt that the king had just canceled. So again, what is it that gets in the way of us forgiving others? The king's answer to what our response should be is clearly demonstrated as Christ's answer in this parable in verse 33. Shouldn't you also have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? As we consider all that God has forgiven us, and we want to hold a debt against someone else, someone whose debt is in fact minuscule compared to the debt that Christ has repaid for us, shouldn't we also have mercy on our fellow servants? 7 times? Or is it just the 3 that the Pharisee suggested? But that's not the answer. The answer we know is one that doesn't have limits. It's not always easy, but it's right. And only a heartless, cruel person would make a friend pay a petty bill in the wake of such an extravagant pardon, such as the king rendered to this servant of his. As children of a compassionate father, we must find it in our hearts to forgive. We need to be forgiven, and we need to become forgivers. This means more than a one-time transaction. It means we strive continually to forgive and to clear the hurts that hold us back. Forgiveness is costly too. After all, look at what it cost Christ. The extravagant form of forgiveness Jesus calls for is only possible when performed as an act of worship. Think about that. I want to say that again because I think this is something that has the opportunity for us to look at forgiveness as something that we are not burdened by, but instead that we have the privilege of emulating Christ in. Forgiveness is something that is only possible in many cases when performed as an act of worship. It doesn't have to be an emotional reaction to some person's action, but it can be a grateful response to our loving God. We forgive for his sake as an offering to him who's forgiven us. Forgiveness is difficult, and one of the things that we looked at as a class, we talked a little bit about a reason why somebody would have a difficult time forgiving somebody else is perhaps they weren't seeking forgiveness, or maybe they didn't consider themselves to have been in a position where they'd done something wrong. But part of being in that exchange is recognizing that we don't only have to render forgiveness. We don't only have to look at other people who we would otherwise consider to be in debt, but we also put ourselves in positions where our actions cause other people to have a strained and burdened relationship with us. And so we need to look at this from the perspective of how to offer an apology and to be willing to seek forgiveness for others. The humility that demonstrates is also something that can set the right example for the people that we would seek to witness to. Now on the screen here, you see a list. I'm just going to read it to you. Some things to consider in offering your own apology is to make it personal. Don't give the apology the excuse of, well, I'm going to write this note or I'm going to send you this message, and you don't get the opportunity to see that I'm sincere. Also, when you're offering your apology, keep your apology focused on what was done wrong, not on maybe what the other person did to cause that thing to occur, because you're not apologizing for their actions. In fact, you're not defending anything. What you're doing is you're asking forgiveness, which means you also don't make excuses. You need to take responsibility for the things that you're asking for forgiveness for, because only in it being accountable for that are you truly acknowledging that it's a debt that you're asking for someone to forgive. Don't rush through an apology like it's an unpleasant task you just want to get behind you. A lot of times we can consider as kids, or maybe as parents, we've told our kids, you apologize to him, or you apologize to her, or you make sure that you guys look at each other and move forward with this. And after you say you're sorry, give each other a hug. And the response more often of, okay, here, I'm sorry, all right, go play. That's not an apology that represents a sincerity, which is important, being sincere. But when you're telling somebody you're sorry and it's clear that they know you don't mean it, you're only deepening the chasm in that relationship. The burden or the debt of something that needs to be forgiven is still there. And a lot of times too, in this last point here, don't ask for anything in return. Most often the thing that we're asking for in return is somebody else to say, I'm sorry too. We're looking for, if I say sorry, maybe they'll realize that I'm the bigger person, and they'll be big about it too, and they'll recognize that they were at fault. You're not asking for somebody else to recognize fault if you're sincerely offering an apology. What you're doing, if you're asking for them to apologize also, not maybe in the way that you're saying, I'll apologize, but you have to apologize too, but just our expectation is what you're doing, you're not asking for an apology, you're just looking for a way past the impasse that this burden is to your relationship. And the only way around it is for somebody to genuinely forgive, and in your case, to be seeking forgiveness legitimately. So maybe we don't have a debt that's so big that would be represented by this 10,000 talent debt that the king had given forgiveness for. But maybe we do have people in our lives that have a comparatively small debt. Maybe it just doesn't compare. It certainly doesn't compare to the debt that Christ paid, our debt. And God forgives, and he can forgive us, and he can allow us to be in a position to forgive others and show him, show her, show anyone the mercy and the grace that God showed on the cross by the way that has changed our lives. So I'll close with this as you consider this lesson and how it might apply to your lives. Ask God for the grace to forgive even in difficult circumstances. It's his grace that we're requesting, and it's his grace that he demonstrated towards us that we want to emulate. Thank God for the forgiveness that he has given to us through Christ.